You don't even know him. You don't even know his real name.
Now I can help with that bit. My real name is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the latest episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very big welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, the films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, an appreciation of just how difficult it is to make a film, and a further appreciation of the fact that they do somehow get through the system and exist. With that preamble done, I'm just going to get on with the first of the two movies I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. It's a very, very rare venture for me into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is covered extensively everywhere else. But I do think the story of that particular universe's opening is a really interesting one. Let me take you to 2008. I'll play you a clip. Come to the story, the other side of this.
No one's allowed to talk, is that it? You can't talk?
No, you intimidate them.
Good God, you're a woman.
Is it better to be feared or respected? And I say, is it too much to ask for both? I humbly present the Jericho. To peace.
Tony Stark. Now you work for me.
What are you building, Stark?
And that then was a clip from 2008's Iron Man. I suspect you've heard of this one. Directed by Jon Favreau, with a screenplay by Mark Fergus, Hawk Ostby, Art Markham and Matt Holloway, and a cast led by Robert Downey Jr., Terrence Howard and Jeff Bridges and Gwyneth Paltrow. So, Iron Man was, of course, the very first movie in what we now know as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And now when we look at Marvel films in that particular universe, from the outside looking in, they seem to have fairly routine journeys to the screen. That means they don't make particularly good fodder for this podcast. But Iron Man was a gamble, a very, very big gamble. And it's also a project that very nearly went off in lots and lots of different directions. So, based on the comic book, of course, the first sign of an Iron Man film, for instance, came all the way back in 1990. And I picked up a story in Starlord magazine revealing at that stage Universal Pictures had picked up the rights to Iron Man. And this was presumably in the aftermath of 1989's Batman going absolutely nuts and launching a bit of a superhero film land rush. That in 1990 we had enormous amounts of resources being poured into the Dick Tracy movie by Disney, for instance, in the hope of having its own Batman. Properties such as The Shadow and The Phantom were beginning their journey to the screen. And the Iron Man film that would have happened at this point, under the stewardship of Universal Pictures, would have been directed by Stuart Gordon. Now, Gordon's popped up on this podcast before when we talked about the film Fortress that he made a few years later. I really like Fortress. But also, he was due to direct Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, but had to pull out of that due to medical reasons. The film he's best known for still, I believe, I'd say, is Reanimator, which still makes him a very odd choice to make Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, but I'd have loved to have seen that version of the film. And it looked like for a short amount of time this Iron Man film was going to happen, and then it fizzled out a little bit for reasons that I couldn't really get to the bottom of. But I mean, Sam Raimi's low-budget Darkman was around this time, and Dick Tracy didn't do the kind of numbers Disney was hoping for either. And also, it shouldn't be forgotten that in 1990, outside of comic book enthusiasts, no one had heard of Iron Man, just didn't have a clue. In fact, by the time the film was ultimately released, that argument was still around. But let's move on a little bit to later on in the 1990s, because the next company to pick up the rights to the Iron Man comics was 20th Century Fox. And for a while, this looked more promising because, I mean, the low profile of the character still didn't help, but Fox was sniffing around and picking up rights to Marvel characters at a point where Marvel financially wasn't really in a position to resist. And so Fox, of course, over time picked up the likes of X-Men, Fantastic Four and Daredevil as well. But again, this one fizzled out a little bit in spite of interest from a couple of high-profile names. That Quentin Tarantino at one stage mentioned being interested in an Iron Man film in that way that Quentin Tarantino tends to mention being interested in things and then them not necessarily happening. Nicolas Cage, I mean, it's no secret he was on the lookout for a comic book movie leader, an absolute comic book movie nut. He would come very close to playing Superman, of course, before eventually he took the title role in Ghost Rider. For a little while, he might have been Iron Man. But the closest it came to just before the version we ultimately got was when New Line Cinema picked up the rights after 20th Century Fox had decided it wasn't going to press ahead with an Iron Man film. And so New Line at the end of the 1990s, that's where we're up to now, was flushed with money from Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me, for instance, and the success of the first Blade film had opened its eyes to the power of superhero films and comic book movies. Blade, a very profitable film that launched a franchise for New Line. And so it bought the rights to Iron Man from Fox. It set about trying to get the film made, and it got quite close too. Now, New Line was pouring huge resources around this time into the Lord of the Rings trilogy as well, but it was about to really hit the jackpot financially off the back of Lord of the Rings. But the financial input in the first place really did put New Line at some degree of risk. However, by the time we get to November 2004, with the profits from the three Lord of the Rings films being wheelbarrowed into the New Line the New Line vaults, it got to a point where it looked like Iron Man was going to happen, and an announcement even came out about it. So in November 2004, Marvel Studios was headed up by a producer called Avi Arad, and there was confidence that this could be put out into the trades, that a script was being put together for an Iron Man film by Al Gough and Miles Miller. They created the TV show Smallville. David Hayter came in to work on the script as well, and it was revealed that Iron Man had a director, Nick Cassavetes, who'd hit big with the Notebook movie, and also at this stage, it's worth noting that Tom Cruise was strongly linked with starring in the title role. And by the end of 2004, with this chatter just bubbling up in the trade press, the talk was this Iron Man could even be in cinemas for 2006. And casting could really get underway. And I mean, this wasn't tittle-tattle or gossip. This was a legitimised statement in the Hollywood press that the production president of New Line Cinema at the time was a man called Toby Emmerich, and he was quoted in these stories. He said, "This is an ideal situation because Nick Cassavetes is a tremendous talent with a passion for the material, and we've had such incredible success working with both him and Marvel in the past. Turning up again to launch a franchise as promising as Iron Man, the eyes even then were on a sequel, is very exciting." So this was a big deal, but as it turned out, the announcement was just a little bit too early. And in fact, you get to the middle of 2005 and there was no movement, and Tom Cruise hadn't actually signed on the dotted line. In fact, nor had Nick Cassavetes at that stage. Everything was fine, and then negotiations got delayed. We lost a year, Avi Arad explained to the website MovieWeb. Mind you, while these negotiations were going on, there were people who were trying to get the script for Iron Man into shape. That Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott, who'd had enormous success with the Pirates of the Caribbean films, they'd worked on it at one point. Joss Whedon had been working on it. And it was a man called Tim Canleys who was said to have got all of this really, really close to a shooting script. And so in 2005, the project was very active at New Line. New Line was, it's a subsidiary of Warner Brothers. But the film was taking its time getting through development hell. It had just stalled a little bit. And unbeknownst to New Line, Marvel had growing plans of its own. And it discovered this when it went to Marvel requesting a pretty standard contract extension for the Iron Man rights and didn't get the answer it was expecting. Because what the team at Iron Man didn't know, in fact, what no one really knew at this point, was a meeting had taken place a couple of years earlier in 2003 when an executive at Marvel by the name of David Maisel went in with an idea. He took it into the office of Avi Arad and also to the CEO of Marvel Studios, a man called Isaac Perlmutter, coming to him shortly. And what Maisel said as he watched money roll in from the likes of Spider-Man and X-Men for Sony and Fox respectively, or based on Marvel properties and topping the box office, it just said, well, Marvel should be financing its own films. It should be producing its own films. And not just that, rather than just leaning on traditional sequels, it should knit them together into some kind of, what do you know, a cinematic universe. And so Perlmutter, a notably frugal man, he saw the advantage of this and he gave Maisel the job of president of Marvel Studios, and a financing deal with the help of Paramount Pictures gave them a little bit of money to play with. And so, I mean, it was no secret that Marvel had been on the verge of going out of business years before. And it had watched these. I mean, Spider-Man was huge. Even the Marvel films that weren't huge, the likes of Hulk and Daredevil, they were still grossing like 9 figures. They were still bringing in cash. And so this plan to start its own run of movies was having to be developed on the quiet. And again, unbeknownst to New Line, Iron Man was the project that the Marvel brass had identified as a starting point. And so it's one of those quirks of cinema history. Had New Line, which had the rights to make an Iron Man film, managed to get their project moving just a few months earlier, then the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we know it, at the very least, would have had a very, very different path. New Line's boss at the time, a man called Bob Shaye, however, he didn't believe in an Iron Man project. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea of a man in a heavy suit flying, and he just felt that the box office was limited. He didn't believe in the project. And even though New Line executives were saying, no, there's something to this, just look at the amount of money Spider-Man's making, Bob Shaye was insistent. Nobody's going to go for a film where someone is flying in such a heavy suit. In fact, in Ben Fritz's book, The Big Picture, The Fight for the Future Movies, which is well worth picking up, there's an exchange with Avi Arad between Bob Shaye and Avi Arad, and Shaye apparently said to him, I'll never make a movie in which Iron Man flies. It just doesn't make any sense. Steel cannot fly. Now, the reason Marvel had identified Iron Man as its first film that it was going to finance itself, well, it was very calculated, it's quite cynical, and it was very surgical, because it went to focus groups. It set a bunch of focus groups up and brought in groups of children, and they were taken through the assorted characters that Marvel, in theory, could make a film out of. There's an excellent Wall Street Journal report about this, and the kids were shown Hulk and Captain America and Iron Man, and the kids weren't asked, which film do you want to see, and, what do you know about this character? They were asked, which toys are you more likely to play with? And when Iron Man was coming out far higher than expected and the most popular choice, that was the thing that was swaying the decision. And so Marvel also fairly quickly went ahead with a Hulk movie, 2008's The Incredible Hulk, but it was beginning work on Iron Man, and that was identified as film number 1, and work began on trying to interest toy companies in picking up the license for Iron Man toys with a view for releasing them in 2008. The problem was, if they were releasing the toys in 2008, now they needed a film to go with them. So, with New Line rebuffed, much to its shock, it was now full steam ahead with Marvel making its own films plan. And Marvel's finances were very much under the iron fist of a fairly infamous man called Ike Perlmutter, who I just mentioned before. And let's just say his penny pinching became the stuff of legend. Now, Perlmutter would ultimately lose a power battle with in the corridors of Marvel with Kevin Feige, who, of course, now heads up the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And at this stage, he was slightly more junior in the organisation. But it got to a point where Disney had to choose between keeping Perlmutter and his very, very, very economical ways, or losing the man who is just credited really as making this cinematic universe project work. And I doubt Disney really blinked there. But at this point in 2005-2006, Ike Perlmutter was the boss. Everyone else was spending $200 million on superhero movies, no matter. Marvel at best had $100 million to play with, and it had to rattle the tins to get that. And I mean, maybe that was what ultimately knocked Tom Cruise out of this one, if he was ever really that close to doing it, because $100 million does not buy you a Tom Cruise movie with a lot of visual effects. And the thinking anyway was that, well, isn't this better with an unknown in it? Because by April 2006, the film had its director. Jon Favreau had bubbled up to the top of the list of potential directors, even though he'd only had 3 relatively modest films to his name at that point. He's got an acting background, of course, but when it came to directing, the scale of his movies wasn't particularly huge. However, he did have an enormous hit in the shape of Elf to his name. His latest film at that point was Zathura. Now, Zathura, I think, is a really terrific family movie, and it's sort of a pseudo-Jumanji sequel, only not a Jumanji sequel. And what was of interest here was that Zathura mixed in a lot of character with visual effects and on a cheap budget. And so this, even though it hadn't spiked at the box office, the film was respected, and what Favreau had managed to do was also respected as well. And there was also the thinking, and it was said to have been part of the decision, that Favreau wasn't a hugely powerful director, really. It wasn't like getting a Spielberg in where you have to cede to what Spielberg wants to do. And the feeling was that Favreau would be happier with some degree of to and fro. There was no way Marvel was ever going to give a director final cut. That would always sit with the studio. But a deal was thrashed out, and in April 2006, Jon Favreau was announced. But not just that, Marvel's ambitious plan for a slate of superhero films. Now, the news as presented to the Hollywood trade press at the time, well, on the one hand, Favreau was talking about how he was looking to realise the Iron Man movie through a mix of motion capture, the integration of miniatures with CGI. And he said, I'm starting to be a lot more convinced by what the technology can do. But the idea of using CGI and relying solely on that to tell your story, those days are past. He says, I think that integrating practical filmmaking and augmenting it with CGI is the way to make it an emotionally involving story. So that was the approach he was going for. The trade press also confirmed that Marvel had a $525 million revolving film financing facility and an overall distribution arrangement with Paramount Pictures. The one film that was outside of that was going to be the Hulk movie due to pre-existing rights issues where Universal was going to distribute that one. But it wasn't just going for one film, it was going for several. There was talk of a Captain America film, of a Thor film, and spoiler, they'd happen, you know. But when we come particularly to Iron Man, work was also now heavily underway on its new script. Art Markham and Matt Holloway had been hired to write a script, and separately the writing partnership of Hawk Otsby and Mark Fergus were working on one as well. And they came to Favreau's desk, and he took the bits of the ones that he liked, and a screenplay was being fashioned together for the movie. So there was still casting, and the challenges here were, first of all, they clearly weren't going for a movie star because they just couldn't afford one, but also they were looking for someone who, I mean, had a degree of profile but didn't need that much profile. So Marvel at one stage was looking at Colin Farrell and Patrick Dempsey as potential candidates. One person who got very, very close was Sam Rockwell, who for a while was Jon Favreau's choice to take on the dual role of Tony Stark and Iron Man. But in the end, Favreau zeroed in on Robert Downey Jr., and this is regarded as one of the finest modern casting decisions in blockbuster cinema. Just the impact and the risk of, I mean, let's face it, Downey Jr.'s reputation at that stage was quite difficult. He'd had a fairly troubled decade or so beforehand and had been tabloid fodder. And, well, you can read about just what he'd been through to that point. But he really wanted this role. He turned up for the audition reportedly in a tuxedo. He won over the executives in the room, and he signed a deal worth $2.5 million, which was announced in September 2006. I mean, by the end, by the time he left the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he was taking 8 figures back away for individual film appearances. But at this stage, he wasn't even the most expensive actor on the call sheet. That crown went to Terrence Howard, who was actually the first person cast in the movie. He had an Oscar nomination to his name, and he reportedly got the highest paycheck of anyone in the film, $3.5 million. And the reason they went for Terrence Howard, well, the thinking was, let's get one really prestigious actor in, but put them in a more frugal supporting role so we don't have to pay them a full leading star salary. Now, Howard, he didn't return for future Marvel films, reportedly asking for more money, which didn't go down particularly well in the halls of Marvel, and he was replaced for Iron Man 2 and onwards in the role that he played by Don Cheadle. Finances too changed the planned villain for the film, because when Iron Man was first talked about at San Diego Comic-Con in 2006, they were openly talking about the Mandarin was going to be the antagonist in the movie. Instead, they went with the more domestic Obadiah Stane, hiring Jeff Bridges to take the role. And what this meant by not going with the Mandarin was it instantly saved the film a whole bunch of money, because now they wouldn't have to film in China to do the backstory of the Mandarin character. And that alone was estimated to save the production some $10 million. The script for the film was going to set the early stages of it, pretty much in a single location, in a cave as well. And right through the screenplay to Iron Man, there was just an eye on how much this was all going to cost. And there's quite a few tricks in there just to mitigate the cost of the film. In fact, Ike Perlmutter was said to be keeping a very, very close eye on the script anyway. And if anything too expensive was written in there, well, the red ink came out. And going back to Ben Fritz's book again, he's just said, he quotes this one passage. He said, when a convoy attack at the beginning of the movie was supposed to include 10 Humvees, Ike Perlmutter apparently said, no, too many, we can do it with 3. Another scene in which Iron Man saves villagers from a group of terrorists was due to cost $1 million, and Perlmutter wouldn't authorise the money for that scene until the very, very last minute, thinking, well, we might not actually need the scene, and he argued that we could get rid of that if all the costs elsewhere were on the up. There was that level of micromanagement on the budget of this still a 9-figure movie. Against this, inevitably, people weren't getting on behind the scenes. There were lots of tensions, and in particular between Avi Arad and Ike Perlmutter, who struck me as two people who weren't really designed to get on. They came from very different ethoses, and they were clashing. This man, you might have heard of, Kevin Feige, he was said to be doing the bulk of the work anyway, and he was climbing up the Marvel pole. But in May 2006, with the Iron Man project finally rolling, and with production looking to start now in 2007, Avi Arad quit Marvel. He resigned his job and set himself up as an independent producer. And Kevin Feige was then moved up to president of production on the Marvel movies. And, well, history started writing itself as well. So on the 12th of March 2007, production on this Iron Man film could finally begin. We're already like 15, 17 years after the very first mention that this might happen. So even though there's a sequence in the movie set in Afghanistan, it probably won't be the biggest surprise to say this was all filmed primarily in and around California. In fact, the extensive sequence at the start of the film that takes place in Afghanistan was built on a soundstage in Los Angeles. What they didn't have when they started filming, as well, as worth noting, was a finished screenplay, that it hadn't been fully knitted together. They had the action beats, they had the underlying story, and there was a confidence that the story they had made sense. What they didn't have was all the dialogue in place. Now, in Favreau's mind, this meant that there was space for improvisation, which I'll come to shortly, and it certainly led to lots of space for trying things out. But the quote I love is Jeff Bridges describing the production of Iron Man as basically a $200 million student film with dialogue for individual scenes just being invented on the day of shooting. I mean, that said, it was still a relatively smooth shoot, and Robert Downey Jr., for one, was particularly enjoying his work. He was liking being given the space to improvise, to make his Tony Stark a slightly more comedic, funny character. Against the backdrop of this, even though things were shooting, toy manufacturers were really reluctant to jump aboard. They shared some of those concerns. Who's going to buy these toys? People are buying Batman toys and Superman toys and Spider-Man toys. Who wants to buy an Iron Man? And in fact, by the time the Iron Man movie came out, there was a distinct lack of official merchandise for it just because the toy companies didn't believe in it. So it was like a mirror of the first Toy Story movie, which took a lot of people by surprise, not least the vast majority of toy manufacturers who turned that film down. Now, one idea they did come up with throughout the shoot, and again, this came relatively late in the day, was perhaps we could do a post-credits scene. And an approach went out to Samuel L. Jackson to see if he'd be interested in helping with that. This post-credit scene was designed and written while the film was underway. And when it came to the shooting of it, they tried to keep it heavily under wraps. They stripped back the crew for the day that particular sequence was shot. It didn't stop the rumours starting to come out that, hang on, there might be a little bit of a surprise at the end of the film. And it's worth noting, at this point in cinema history, it wasn't really the thing that people would sit for 15 minutes through the credits in the hope of seeing an extra sequence at the end. So this was going to be a slightly new thing as well. So not only were they not making direct sequels and they were building something that was ideally knitted together across several films, just the idea of putting those little joins at the end, well, it was ahead of the game thinking, really. The film wrapped up shooting on the 25th of June 2007, and even by this stage, the economics of it were testing because Marvel just didn't have a lot of money for this. That the projections at this stage was that the film was going to gross about $100 million in America, and that would just break even. That was it. That wouldn't leave a lot of room for profit at all. And the pressure was on. I mean, to a degree, it's no wonder that Ike Perlmutter was so keen to save every cent that he could find on the budget, because the feeling amongst box office analysts was Marvel would be lucky to see its money back on this, and if it did, you don't go planning a particularly nice Christmas party. But then things started to turn, even as the movie was in post-production. I mean, at Comic-Con in 2007, the first trailer went down a storm. And what was interesting about it was instantly fans seemed to latch, even people who'd never heard of Iron Man, seemed to latch onto the fact that, hang on, there's a tonal shift here. Because the successful comic book movies of the 2000s, I mean, this was Batman Begins era, Superman Returns was just coming. They just had a slightly darker edge to them. And here was something light and funny. And hang on, this feels a bit different. And from that point on, really, the promotion began to motor and the fan enthusiasm started to grow. Would it be enough to get the kind of mainstream numbers that Marvel was looking for? Well, clearly yes, but we don't know that yet because we've not come to that bit of the story. I do want to flag up that Jon Favreau gives an interesting interview in the Disney Plus series Light and Magic, which tells about the light and times as well of Industrial Light and Magic, the famous effects house. And Favreau talks, I mean, he's interviewed there and looking at the effects work that's been done in there and kind of realising what they were able to do, what they could achieve via VFX work and still keep the human being in there. I do recommend just like seeking that out and taking a look. Heading, though, into April of 2008 with the film finished, this was going to be the big moment. This was it. Iron Man was going to premiere in Australia on April the 14th, 2008, and then it would begin its box office rollout at the end of April. It wouldn't land in America till May, actually. But the reviews started coming in, and the reviews were, I mean, they weren't far off ecstatic, actually. In particular, Robert Downey Jr.'s casting was very, very highly praised. But there was a real feeling that they captured something here, that the film was a little bit of a shift, hugely entertaining. Perhaps it wibbles and wobbles a little bit at the end, but a very, very good blockbuster movie. So it needed to make that $100 million at the US box office during its run for Marvel really to break even. On its opening weekend in the US alone of May the 2nd to the 4th, it took $98.6 million. Iron Man was an absolute sensation, and Marvel's Cinematic Universe project was launched. I mean, it would stumble a little bit with The Incredible Hulk, but, spoiler, they found their feet again. So, the competition wasn't massively strong in the States that week, although ironically, the other big opener against it that weekend starred Patrick Dempsey in a film called Maid of Honor, and that helped itself to $14.7 million, but it was never really going to put a dent in Iron Man's armour. The other films that are around in the top 10, just to give you a flavour, Baby Mama was number 1 the week before. Harold and Kumar Escape from Guantanamo Bay. Nim's Island was in there, 21. Prom Night. But what Marvel had done is it had scheduled the film early enough in the summer to basically be the first big blockbuster of the season and to give itself a bit of space. Now, the films that really suffered were the ones that came afterwards. Fox released a relatively big budget comedy with Cameron Diaz, What Happens in Vegas, the week after. The Wachowskis' Speed Racer movie, which I'm coming to on a future episode, that came out from Warner Brothers. Both of those couldn't hold a torch to Iron Man, which helped itself to another $50 million in its second weekend. And it was only knocked off the top in the end by the Chronicles of Narnia Prince Caspian a couple of weeks later. But by that stage, Iron Man was well on its way to being basically a summer sensation. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull toddled along with a $100 million opening weekend. Iron Man had been $2 million short of that. And by the time Iron Man completed its US box office run, $318 million were in the bank, with another $266 million overseas. The worldwide take for Iron Man on its initial cinema release was $585 million. Robert Downey Jr. was now a huge movie star. Marvel's project had been legitimised at enormous speed. As a result, several films started accelerating their way towards the big screen. But perhaps the biggest achievement of everything, the thing that really showed just how much Marvel had achieved here, that this idea it had come up with like 5 or 6 years later had been realised so dramatically well. Well, there was no bigger reward than this. Ike Perlmutter opened his wallet and allowed Maisel, heading up Marvel, to buy Downey and Favreau a thank you car. I tell you what, you give them all the Oscars in the world, you give them all the box office taking in the world, getting a few dollars off Ike Perlmutter, there's no achievement quite like it. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. I'm going to do my very boring parish notices. First, I'm going to tell you about a brand new live In Conversation With event that we're recording in London on Wednesday, the 5th of October. And tickets are available for this now if you want to be in the audience. We are doing a live podcast special with filmmaker Paul Feig. We're going to be talking about Bridesmaids, Spy, Ghostbusters, A Simple Favour, The School for Good and Evil. You can find ticket details to that on our website, filmstories.co.uk. If you like this podcast and don't mind doing us a favour and supporting us, there are 3 ways you can back us. Financially, if you want to back us, if you can go to patreon.com/Simon Brew, you get the podcast early. You find out the gossip of what we're up to. You'd have found out about the Paul Feig show a couple of weeks ago as well. The money from the Patreon is then ploughed back into the Film Stories project. Sadly, I don't spend it on coffee. And thank you so much to everyone who supports us there. If you can subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice, that also helps us enormously and is really appreciated. Likewise, if you can leave us a review, ideally a hugely positive one, stuff like that helps podcasts like this and just helps us get noticed. Thank you to everyone who's done that. But I think that's enough parish notices, isn't it? Let me get on with the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this Film Stories. This time I'm going back to 1990 to a thriller. I'm going to play you a clip from the thriller that tries to make you feel sympathetic for landlords. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
What do you think?
750 grand, huh?
We'll fudge the numbers a little.
Yeah, we're just a little bit nervous. We've never made this kind of investment before.
I know.
This legal description of building.
It's a wooden building with windows.
So we rent the studio for $1,000 and 1 bedroom for $1,200.
1,300. You should go up and down.
Brand new gas stove, disposal, microwave. You have to remember that this is an investment, Patty.
It's not just an investment, it's our home.
Mr. Palmer, right?
Goodman.
Hi, Carter Hayes.
We've done a beautiful job here.
So, that one's a clip from a 1990 thriller by the name of Pacific Heights, directed by John Schlesinger, written by Daniel Pine and starring Melanie Griffith, Matthew Modine and Michael Keaton. Now, John Schlesinger, I should know, a legendary director who won the Best Director Oscar for Midnight Cowboy, and on his CV, films such as Billy Liar, Far from the Madding Crowd, Marathon Man, what a film that is, The Day of the Locust, Sunday Bloody Sunday. Pretty much the last person on paper you'd expect to be directing, from the surface, a fairly standard 1990s thriller, because Hollywood loved these thrillers in the 90s. I've talked about them a few times. We did Sleeping with the Enemy on the podcast a few weeks ago, and it's a not dissimilar kind of template. They're relatively cheap to produce, and thrillers just tended to go down particularly well. So the origins of this one go back to screenwriter Daniel Pine. And I mean, he gave an interview to Creative Screenwriting talking about his origins. And he's just said, I was a struggling fiction writer after college. He went to UCLA and graduated in the early 1980s. And he said, I thought maybe I could support my prose by writing television or films. And he said he quickly discovered that this was a career and not just a job, and fell in love with writing screenplays. But it was with TV that he had his first breakthroughs and his first work, that he landed work on a couple of TV shows. You might not have heard of the one Matt Houston. I'd imagine you've definitely heard of the one Miami Vice. He also created a cop show called The Street, but he was writing scripts and his aim was films. Could he get a movie off the ground? Well, let's just say he was about to have a whole lot of success there. So, in this particular case, the idea for a film called Pacific Heights came to him because he and his wife had an apartment in the San Francisco area in the US, and the genesis of the movie came from there, because the reported story was that they had a problem with a tenant and they couldn't get the tenant out of their apartment. And they just planted the seed in Pine's mind for a kind of thriller. Now, this was very much in tone of keeping of the 1990s. I mean, Fatal Attraction had been a huge hit in 1987. Jagged Edge had hit a few years before. But also, this was kind of the yuppie era, the posh people era coming through. And here, what Pine was putting together was, on the surface, a story about some rich people trying to turf someone out of their house. And as I said before, make you feel sympathetic for landlords. I would love to see them try that now. It would be really quite something. And so he penned his screenplay, and unusually for the Film Stories podcast, this was a tale that suddenly went at great speed, because the screenplay got picked up fast. It soon found itself under the stewardship of producer Scott Rudin. Morgan Creek, the company that was about to enjoy huge success with films like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and The Last of the Mohicans, was backing the movie as well. There was a distribution deal in place with 20th Century Fox. In fact, this would be the last Morgan Creek film distributed by 20th Century Fox. But the point was, this was up and running really incredibly quickly. What helped, of course, was its constituent parts were able to come together at speed as well. That Pine's screenplay was, I mean, it was clearly good enough to get the movie a green light. And he would say he would never have a project go anywhere near this quickly again. But also finding a director was relatively swift, because at this stage in his career, John Schlesinger's Hollywood star was not what it was, in spite of the incredible films he'd made to that point. And so he was approached to see if he'd be interested in directing the film. And, well, you know, it was a job. It was also a job with the influence. I mean, came up in a couple of interviews, the influence of Alfred Hitchcock over it. I mean, Schlesinger was well aware of the influence of Hitchcock and interest in that. Pine had already cited Hitchcock as a big influence, but there was still enough in here that they could make it their own. Now, Schlesinger admitted in interviews he hadn't gone through anywhere near the same experience that the characters in the film go through. If you're unfamiliar with Pacific Heights, the very, very basic conceit is just what Pine had gone through, that a couple lease an apartment, rent an apartment to a mysterious person. Mysterious person turns out to be the tenant from hell. But what Schlesinger tapped into was just the idea that home is a place of security for most people, and that kind of privacy matters. And that's really what he wanted to capture in the film. That's what he wanted at the heart of the thriller. Now, when it came to casting, again, this came together relatively quickly, that Melanie Griffith just had a gap in her schedule before she was due to go off and make The Bonfire of the Vanities, so she was able to shoot the movie. Matthew Modine, meanwhile, I mean, he was juggling the film Memphis Belle that would come out the same year as Pacific Heights. It was seen that was going to be a big year for him, the one where perhaps he made his box office breakthrough, and so he signed on the dotted line to appear in this as well. The appeal of Schlesinger was just a big one there too. And then there was Michael Keaton. Now, Michael Keaton, at the point he signed up for Pacific Heights, was red hot off the back of 1989's Batman. There's that film coming up again. And what was he going to follow Batman up with? Well, the pressure was on him to do, Batman 2. And Keaton, in the back of his mind, I mean, he gave interviews and I remember him saying, we'll probably do that. But he was looking for something slightly different. He didn't just want to do the same thing over and over again. And when the role of Carter Hayes in the film Pacific Heights came to him, well, that kind of fitted what he was looking to do. Now, Schlesinger was admitted that he'd seen Batman. He was aware of Michael Keaton. He'd seen him in Beetlejuice as well. But the film that really, really impressed him and convinced him that Michael Keaton was right to play the antagonist role in this movie was a film Clean and Sober. Now, Clean and Sober hasn't been widely seen, but it's very, very, very worth seeking out. And Keaton gives a brilliant performance in that. And so Schlesinger was convinced that he was the right person for the role. And of course, the studio were really happy to sign Michael Keaton up. It was Batman. He was in the biggest film of the year before. Why wouldn't they want him to sign on the dotted line? And so that key cast had come together. Melanie Griffith, Matthew Modine and Michael Keaton. And just for fun as well, Tippi Hedren, Melanie Griffith's mother, was cast in a small role in the movie as well. And 8 months from finishing the screenplay, the first shot of Pacific Heights was in the can and the film was up and running. Now, I should note that just because it was an 8-month gap, that didn't mean there weren't changes to the script. In fact, Matthew Modine talked about this in an interview with the AV Club, and he explained how characters were slightly changed because, in Modine's word, in the original script, not between myself, but Michael Keaton's character wanted to, I can't read that, cluck everybody. That's odd. And he said if I had a dog, he would have wanted to screw my dog. That's nice. That was the script that John Schlesinger was given, that the character that Keaton would ultimately go on to play was originally written as an angry guy who wanted to hurt people. It wasn't me specifically or my wife specifically. He wanted to hurt people. He wanted to hurt the world because he was kind of like a trust fund baby whose family had cut off his trust money and he was angry, so he wanted to screw everybody. And so Modine also added, I think what they wanted to take the idea of homosexuality out of the story, a direct quote as well, that he said John Schlesinger was gay, and I think that was part of the reason John was attracted to the material, not just specifically because of that, but I think he liked the elements of that, just somebody who was a sexual and pathological deviant. I'm doing direct quotes there rather than throw any personal opinion on there, and John Schlesinger has long passed, sadly, and so I couldn't get a more up-to-date interview off him just to kind of clarify any of that. Now, Schlesinger, in an interview with Film Talk, would play down the influence of Hitchcock, and that word was coming up again and again. He said, he acknowledged it, but he said, I don't sit down and look at Hitchcock films and then say, let's make it, and we'll use this and that. But Schlesinger said, I think Hitchcock used very clever irony, because he's British, of course, horror and suspense brilliantly. And he said, I'm afraid that Americans are not very big on irony. It's direct quotes again. I'm not trying to offend everybody. He said, I do like the sharpness of thrillers, the possibilities of when you're playing games with the audience. Now, one person who agreed to take an uncredited role in the movie as a favour to John Schlesinger was Beverly D'Angelo. And so she's not credited in the film. And it was her request in the end that she wasn't credited in the film. So, and it's quite a sizable role she has in the movie as well. But that's how she appeared in it. I should note as well that I found a rumour online that Christopher Reeve was rumoured to be in the running for this one at this stage, but I couldn't find a second thing to back it up. So I would take that with a degree of salt, really. Melanie Griffith had to fit in shooting and be released in time for The Bonfire of the Vanities, which was going to be a huge Bruce Willis, Tom Hanks project that Warner Brothers was playing a lot of money into. But in January 1990, shooting on Pacific Heights could get underway in the California area of the US, again, less than a year after the screenplay had been completed. So, I mean, a lot of the film is set around a particular house, and this was one that they found in San Francisco, not in the exact area that the film is set, but enough that they could disguise it. And what they had to do, I'm giving as little away about the film as possible. Let's just say the first day of shooting, they had the house in the movie set up to look its very worst. They got the shots they needed that would appear later in the film, and then they had to go away and shoot elsewhere for a while that house was restored and brought back to some degree of normality, and then they could get a lot of the establishing and earlier shots in the film. They did 3 or 4 weeks in the end of location shooting before they headed back to the Culver City area onto sound stages. On the sound stages, they then built the interiors of the film's main Victorian house as well, and they shot there for several weeks. But the filming of this movie wasn't actually said to be a whole lot of fun. And it's only recently I've discovered the podcast of the late Gilbert Gottfried, and I do hugely recommend it. And Gottfried and Frank Santori, his co-host, interview Matthew Modine on one of their episodes. And Modine lifts the lid really on the experience of making Pacific Heights, because around the time of the film's release, he gave an interview and he was asked what's it like working with John Schlesinger. And Schlesinger, by reputation, was a pleasant man. But Modine just left pauses. There was something odd about his response to that. And many years later, he clarified to Gilbert Gottfried that it was not a fun experience at all, that Schlesinger was having a lot of problems on the film. Melanie Griffith was going through problems in her personal life, which, again, you can look up elsewhere if you particularly want to. So it wasn't the easiest star to deal with. But then also Michael Keaton was the most expensive ingredient of the film, and Modine says he was being paid somewhere in the region of $1 million a week for his role in the movie. He's not in it an awful lot, but every week they kept Keaton there, the film got more expensive. It was already on a tight schedule, and the pressure was on Schlesinger really to get what he needed from Keaton and to minimise the cost there. The result of that for Schlesinger was that he was struggling with Melanie Griffith, he was struggling with getting all of Michael Keaton's material in, and he was using, in Modine's words, Matthew Modine as something of a release valve. And as Gottfried observed in his podcast, Matthew Modine was effectively being punished for being the nice one, that Schlesinger was not particularly pleasant, apparently, to Modine on the set of Pacific Heights, didn't treat him well at all, even though Modine was probably the easiest of the starring actors to work with on this one. And it got to a point where, after filming was complete, Schlesinger sought Matthew Modine out and apologised to him and explained that he was having so much trouble on the movie that he was the only person he could really take it out on, and thus he took it out on him. And I think it kind of coloured Matthew Modine's experience and feelings towards John Schlesinger. I've been a huge Midnight Cowboy fan, and it just kind of took a little bit of the edge off. That said, I mean, the promotional interviews that were being given around the time were very much, towing the party line, really. And also Pacific Heights, even though there was interest in it because of the star power of it, it wasn't a major film to be covered by the Hollywood trades in the build-up to its release. So there wasn't really the seeking out of an awful lot of gossip on it. I mean, Melanie Griffith, for instance, I watched a bunch of promotional interviews that she gave for the film. She talks about it being a great film to make, although admitting it got pretty tense in places, as the thrillery elements ratcheted up in the film itself, and she talked of 5 days in particular towards the end of the film. It was quite tense filming a lot of that stuff. Then there was a book, I mean, it's quite a gossipy book called James Ulmer's Hollywood Hot List. I've only just found this, and again, I've only got one source for this, but I'll quote. It talks about territorial, how do you even say this word? Territoriality over trailers can incite Winnie wars between stars. And the anecdote it cites is, during the filming of Pacific Heights, a crew member witnessed Michael Keaton, allegedly, reportedly with measuring tape in hand, checking out how much bigger Melanie Griffith's Winnebago was than his. I have no idea if that was true or not, but it just suggested there were just a few more tensions than we were sort of getting in the press at the time. I mean, the film was being referred to on the set as Fatal Tenant. They just felt that they were going a little bit close to Fatal Attraction there, and certainly Morgan Creek wouldn't have minded the kind of money that Fatal Attraction minded either. All notwithstanding, the film wrapped up shooting towards in the spring of from 1990 with a production budget of around $15-16 million in the end. So relatively frugal by 1990 standards. And if it could make a good 50 million at the box office, I mean, everyone was going to be happy there. John Schlesinger was on the promotional trail for the movie, and he says, apart from the fact I hope it's an entertaining psychological suspense film, he says, I think underlying it is the proviso, don't let possessions possess you. He says, I've certainly been guilty of that in my life. The other thing it deals with is the invasion of one's own space. Most people in their lives have probably invited someone to stay who overstays their welcome. He said, I've certainly had that experience, and I've had the experience of changing the locks. That said, Schlesinger knew what he was making and knew what he wasn't. He knew this was a Hollywood thriller at heart. He knew this wasn't going to be regarded as one of his finest films, but still, he was having some degree of fun with it. There was a little bit of tussle in the aftermath of the movie with a company called Orkin Exterminating, who had apparently paid $20,000 for product placement in the movie on the condition that it appeared in a non-disparaging and non-denigrative manner. Now, an actor in the film, Tracy Walter, turns up wearing an Orkin uniform at this point, and in the movie, the character is said to be, quote, unwilling or unable to perform competent extermination services. And this wasn't the reputation that Orkin Exterminating Company wanted to pay its money to put across. And so it sued Fox and Morgan Creek Films, it sued John Schlesinger and others for libel and breach of contract in the end. And I can't find out how that settled, but it did entertain me enormously. And if ever I need exterminating services, you rest assured I'm going to be seeking out Orkin. The film landed in front of critics ahead of its release in 1990, although we wouldn't get this one in the UK for about another year after this. Still, the first round of critics, I mean, they were okay on it. They saw it for what it was, really, a fairly standard by-the-numbers Hollywood thriller with a few interesting elements to it. And this was also Michael Keaton's first outright villain role as well. And so that was cited as a positive in a lot of reviews, but also this whole idea that this was yuppies in trouble and where should we be putting our sympathies, really. And so the film gained attention by the fact it was a John Schlesinger movie, and also that Michael Keaton was playing this villainous role. And it opened on September the 28th, 1990 in the US. And that opening weekend of the 28th to the 30th, it was the #1 film in America. Now, September at this stage was an off-peak time to release movies. It's where you released films if you wanted them to have a long awards run, but also if you were putting a commercial film out, you sort of knew you weren't going to get absolutely blockbusting levels of box office. Pacific Heights opened with a perfectly decent $6.9 million, actually. It knocked Goodfellas off the top of the chart as well. Goodfellas had opened the week before. Ghost was still around in the top 10. The other new opener was Dark Angel. Do you remember that? And other movies that were hanging around, Postcards from the Edge, Narrow Margin was in there, Death Warrant, Flatliners, Presumed Innocent was there too. Also opening that week on a smaller number of screens with Texasville and King of New York. Quite a week for new opening there. Pacific Heights, though, didn't hang around at the top spot for very long at all. In fact, within a week or two, it had been overtaken by Marked for Death with Steven Seagal and Memphis Belle with Matthew Modine, and had dropped down to 6th place in just a matter of weeks. But it had done decent enough business, really, just not huge thrillery amounts. The total box office in the US in the end was $29 million. It made another $26 million outside of the US. So what, $55 million all in? And with the promise of it being a fairly decent and reliable VHS rental as well, Pacific Heights was just seen as exactly what it was, a modest success. And it's one that pops up now on quite a few lists off the back of Michael Keaton's performance and just how creepy that performance actually is. The one postscript to this particular story, though, there was never a Pacific Heights 2, but there is a plan from Morgan Freeman Productions to do a Pacific Heights TV series. This was announced in March of 2021 with, quote, a surprising and cheeky gender role reversal. Quite what a cheeky gender role reversal is, I've got no idea. I've sat through Pacific Heights a few times. I'm not the person to go to with plans for that. But as it stands, it is a standalone thriller, perhaps with a TV show coming as well. And I just think it's quite an interesting footnote in the career of a hugely acclaimed filmmaker. And that brings us to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. Thank you for everyone who's been seeking out our new podcast as well, the Film Quiz podcast, which is available wherever you get podcasts and bits and bobs. If I've not completely bored you, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. The Film Stories website is at filmstories.co.uk. I'm saying Film Stories a lot here. There you'll find news, reviews, features updated every weekday. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, then you can find Film Stories print magazines as well as Film Stories Blu-ray and Film Junior magazine, and lots of those are available to buy there. But the most important thing, as always, is you all stay safe and well. I'm hugely appreciative that you've taken the time to listen to this podcast. You all look after yourselves. You all take care. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.